All right, let's get into this week's writing instruction. So we wanted to talk about prompt analysis and writing for a rhetorical situation, okay? So when it says writing for a rhetorical situation, all it's asking you is to think like a writer, in the sense that we look at texts or passages that we've read in the past. So for example, when you're reading a rhetorical analysis passage, you're looking for, the speaker, the purpose, and all that. And that's, as a reader, you're analyzing the rhetorical situation of that writer. So when we're talking about writing for a rhetorical situation, we're just kind of flipping the situation. So for example, I gotta turn my pen on here. For example, instead of a speaker, now we have you. You are part of the rhetorical situation, okay? And just like before, the other pieces are the subject and the audience. So, for instance, with your AP FRQs, your audience is an AP reader. And your subject is prompt specific, okay? So when you're writing for a rhetorical situation, this rhetorical situation, you are the speaker, your subject is determined by the prompt, and your audience is an AP reader. Now, why does that matter? For this situation, we're trying to impress this person. So a good example of thinking about the rhetorical situation is when we were talking about evidence a couple weeks ago, we were talking about Burrito Girl, right? Rip Burrito Girl who thinks facing the unknown is eating a chicken burrito, right? That is an example of misreading your audience. Your audience is an adult who probably has a better sense of the unknown than a chicken burrito, right? So that would be an example of writing to the wrong rhetorical situation. So that said, what I want to talk about today particularly is prompt analysis, because if we look at these questions they give us for the exam, the bottom line is the easiest way to fail is to misread the question, okay? Because if you think about what the rubric has, there's 1 point for thesis. If your thesis is not driven by the task, you're not going to get the point, no matter how good the thesis statement is, okay? With evidence and commentary, you're not going to get above a 1 because a 0, frankly, is saying that you misidentified the task or what you were supposed to do, but they might generously give you a 1 because you wrote well enough, okay? So that said, when we're talking about prompt analysis, it is so important for us to identify the task appropriately. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to look through 3 different AP prompts, the ones from your mock exam, and then I'm going to show you a tool that I call Big Idea Prompt Analysis that kind of makes sure you're thinking about the right thing and answering the right question, okay? So first things first, let's look at just the prompt for the question 1 synthesis. Now, like we've practiced before, it's really wise to go into the sources knowing what you're going to write about. So having that thesis. So if you notice, I don't have sources. I just have the next prompt on the document, okay? So we are just looking at the prompt sheet and just reading for tasks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the prompt and I'm going to highlight when I see the task statement, okay? The need to memorialize events or people is complex. In some cases, monuments honor moments of great achievement, while in other cases, monuments pay homage to deep sacrifice. A monument's size, location, and materials are all considerations in planning and creating a memorial to the past. Read the following 7 sources carefully, including the introductory information for each source. Then, in a well-organized essay that synthesizes at least 3 of the sources for support, examine the factors a group or agency should consider in memorializing an event or person and in creating a monument. So right there is my task statement. On test day, I know that now we might be doing a different format this year, but it's important that you underline that task, you memorize that task, and the next thing is that you keep it in your visual eyeline. I notice when we do mock exams, a lot of times you guys will look at the prompt and then set it on the floor. That's the worst thing you could do because you want to keep that visual reminder always next to you so that as you're writing, you remember to go back to that question, okay? So circle it, underline it, whatever you gotta do, make sure you identify what the task is, okay? And then as you know, the rest of our synthesis prompt is just kind of the requirements. So that said, our task is to write an essay which has 3 sources that examines the factors a group should consider. So, right here, this word, the factors for consideration, are what this essay needs to be about. A lot of times, and a few of you on your mock read this and thought that they were asking your opinion on monuments in general. That would be a misreading, and that would be the wrong task, which would be a 0 or 1 for evidence and commentary. Make sure, I can't express how important this is, that you address this task in your writing. So let's look at that big idea prompt analysis we talked about. So we already did the first part, which is the essential question, right? What factors should an agency consider when making a monument? And that, as you know, came directly from what we just highlighted, okay? The next thing to do is to think about some big ideas. Whenever you're writing persuasively, you want to connect back to those universal truths, right? We talked about that with your introduction for rhetorical analysis. Start big and narrow it down. The same applies with a persuasive essay like a synthesis or an argument. And if we go back to our prompt, they've actually kind of alluded to some for us because they use the word achievement and sacrifice, right? Those are big ideas, and those are things that we could attach to at the beginning of our essay, right? We could talk about how monuments, when they're best created, recognize the sacrifice of the individuals represented. And that would be a great statement that is universal and that people can connect to. We can also talk about achievement and how achievement deserves to be rewarded, and one way to do that is a monument. That's another way I could start. So, that said, I'm going to put those as my big ideas. Achievement or sacrifice. Obviously, if I was going to write, I would then choose one big idea to start my introduction with. So, what I need to do then to create a thesis is answer this, okay? I'm just going to answer that question. So, what factors should an agency consider when making a monument? And if I'm going to talk about achievement, I'm going to say that an agency must consider how a monument respects, trying to think of another word, not good, how it respects beneficial achievements, and so for a second one, I might say something using my little PEEPS framework. I might just say, and the cost to erect that monument. This right here would be a point, okay? So I start with, number 1, what is my essential question? 2, what is a big idea I can connect to? And then 3, statement, okay? Now, your thesis statement does not need to necessarily reference the big idea, but like we talked about with the I want a wife paragraph, it's a great place to start an introduction so you have that universal idea, okay? All right, let's look at another one. So now I'm going to switch to my highlighter again. I'm going to highlight the task in this prompt. The passage below is from Last Child in the Woods by Richard Louv. Read the passage carefully. Then, in a well-developed essay, analyze the rhetorical strategies Louv uses to develop his argument about the separation between people and nature. Support your analysis with specific references to the text. So here is my task statement. In a well-developed essay, analyze the rhetorical choices or strategies, right? And I'm going to do the exact same thing I just did. So if I was to reframe this as an essential question, it would say, what rhetorical strategies does Louv use to develop his argument about the separation, right? Because they're looking for me to analyze those. So, what rhetorical choices does Louv use to, I think the word they use is develop. Yep, develop his argument. But I'm going to add one thing to the question because it's not as simple as just listing things, right? Because it has this word analyze here. So I'm going to say, what rhetorical choices does Louvre use to develop his argument, and how do they support his purpose? So this is my essential question. Now, the good thing about rhetorical analysis is this is always your essential question. You just change the author's name, right? So what rhetorical choices does Kelly use to develop her argument, and how does that support her purpose? What does JFK use? It doesn't matter because we're always doing two things. What are the choices, and how does it support purpose, right? Now, again, going to my prompt, if I'm going to connect to a big idea in this one, again, pretty simple, right? I'm just going to look right there. Nature. This is about nature. So again, I can use that in my introduction however I want. To create a thesis statement then, again, we're answering our question. And I want to identify the choices as well as purpose. So this is a scenario where you can either do one sentence that does both of those things, or you can do two sentences. Okay, so I'm going to show you how I would do it in one sentence. But like I said, you could have one sentence identifying the rhetorical choices and a second that links that to purpose or states the purpose. Okay, so for this one, my thesis, I definitely need to kind of know my choices. So had I read this, I mean, I know that it asks the questions. It has the illustration about the car. So Louvre blanks and blanks, right? Those are my two choices because before I read the passage, I can't really identify those. But Louvre illustrates his own childhood interactions with nature and shares an anecdote from his friend buying a car to criticize our separation from nature. Again, I got my essential question, thought about the big idea, came down here and made it a thesis statement. Obviously, before I wrote like an actual thesis statement for rhetorical analysis, I would read the passage. So that would be specific, and I could fill in these two choices. Okay? All right, last prompt to look at. This one, again, switching to my highlighter so I can identify the task. For centuries, prominent thinkers have pondered the relationship between ownership and the development of self-identity, ultimately asking the question, what does it mean to own something? Plato argues that owning objects is detrimental to a person's character. Aristotle claims that ownership of tangible goods helps to develop moral character. 20th century philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre proposes that ownership extends beyond objects to include intangible things as well. In Sartre's view, becoming proficient in some skill and knowing something thoroughly means that we own it. Think about the differing views of ownership. Then write an essay in which you explain your position on the relationship between ownership and sense of self. Use appropriate evidence from your reading, experience, or observation to support your argument. So again, here's my task sentence. And there's something that I want to point out. Does it mention any of the three philosophers it just talked about in this task statement? No. You do not need to agree with one of them. You do not even need to reference one of them. It is asking you to tell the reader what is the relationship between ownership of material things and your identity. Okay? These quotes or these opinions are just there to relay some ways that people could make a relationship between the two, okay? And I think that was a big point of confusion. You all felt that you had to agree with one of them. Not the case. I mean, you might agree with one of them, and that does become your thesis in saying that owning things is detrimental to your self-identity. That's a relationship, and that aligns to what Plato said. But in no way do I have to refer to these philosophers. They are simply asking me, what is the relationship between ownership and self? Okay? which is my essential question. What is the relationship between ownership and self? For our big ideas, here's one right here. It's about identity, right? And ownership. So that's simple. Because those are our big ideas. Okay? So then all I need to do is answer this question, just like I did with the other ones, right? What is the relationship between ownership and self? And then I could argue something like ownership of material things has no bearing on one's identity. And that would be a relationship between ownership and identity. Okay? Now, the point of doing this with the essential questions and kind of creating your thesis that way is that you always have a question that you can keep coming back to. Okay? When you are answering that question, when you should be answering that question is in every single paragraph. So when we have this kind of essential question that we're answering in the essay, the last 2 sentences of every body paragraph then should be answering that question, okay? So this step in prompt analysis can be really helpful in making sure that you're being consistent with your evidence and commentary. All right, I hope that helped. The biggest takeaways, guys, are make sure you're identifying that task statement, taking your time to do so, and then, like I said, translating it into a question form that you can answer, because the answer to that question is what you are going to do in every single body paragraph.